When oil revenues exploded from $2.4 billion in 1972 to over $20 billion by 1977, Iran appeared to be a global economic juggernaut, yet within 18 months the stock exchange lost 99% of its value. This systemic collapse proves that wealth stored within a domestic regime, regardless of a 9% annual GDP growth, remains entirely vulnerable to total confiscation once the political foundation shifts. True financial preservation is not found in the heat of an overheating market, but in the decisive move toward portable, non-domestic assets before the exit closes forever. Picture a household in North Tehran during the autumn of 1977, where the very walls of the living room had appreciated by 300% in just 4 short years. This domestic scene was the portrait of success under a regime that had propelled Iran to become the 18th largest economy on the planet, expanding its gross domestic product at a rate exceeding 9% annually for nearly 2 decades. The husband in this home applied his skills at a prominent Western engineering firm, while the wife held a respected position teaching at a university. Their financial portfolio was a diversified map of the era's prosperity, comprising significant shares on the Tehran Stock Exchange, substantial savings secured in a private bank, and a second apartment recently acquired as a strategic investment. At that moment, the Iranian rial held firm at 70 to the United States dollar, backed by an ocean of oil revenue that had surged from $2.4 billion in 1972 to a staggering $20 billion per year by 1977. However, a financial system can resemble a skyscraper with a hollow foundation. It looks magnificent until the earth shifts. Within a mere 18 months, this family's world would be pulverized. The stock exchange was destined to hemorrhage 99% of its value, their private bank would be seized by the state, and the engineering firm would vanish entirely. The investment apartment was marked for confiscation, and the rial began a downward spiral that has never found its floor. This concludes our series, Empire of Silver and Gold. We previously witnessed wealth erased by the swords of conquerors, the chains of dependency, and the fires of international retaliation. Now, we examine a catastrophe where the arsonist is already standing in the foyer. What remains of your life's work when the very bedrock of the political and economic order is swapped for an entirely different reality overnight? The mid-1970s projected the image of a nation crossing the threshold into the elite club of developed powers. Following the 1973 oil shock, which saw crude prices leap from roughly $3 to nearly $12 per barrel, Iran's output scaled to over 6 million barrels a day, cementing its status as the 4th largest producer in the world. The Shah's ambitious modernization efforts had already granted land to over 2 million peasant families and fostered a new class of more than 1 million small business owners while literacy rates climbed. The international community was deeply invested, with 500 American corporations active in the country and 12,000 Americans residing in Isfahan alone. Western observers confidently forecasted that Iran would achieve full development within a single generation. By 1978, the Tehran Stock Exchange, which had debuted with only 6 companies in 1967, was processing nearly $500 million in trades. Yet, this engine was running too hot for its own cooling system. While inflation had been a whisper at 2.6% during the 1960s, it had screamed past 24% by 1977. Investment was accelerating at 56% annually, leaving infrastructure in the dust. Ports became choked with undelivered goods, while massive building projects staggered under heavy budgets and missed deadlines. Perhaps most dangerously, the nation was fracturing into 2 separate psychological territories. The new, Western-educated technocrats, who were the chief heirs of the oil wealth, effectively lived in a separate universe from the traditional bazaar merchants who had been the heartbeat of Iranian trade for centuries. This cultural canyon would ultimately decide who survived the coming storm. The end began with the oil worker strikes in the autumn of 1978. By January 1979, production had crashed by nearly 5 million barrels a day, a 90% collapse. On December 26, 1978, the taps were shut off completely for export. As the system fractured, over 400 bank branches were scorched or leveled, and the flight of capital reached the velocity of a panic stampede. ND Investment Apartment. The world they knew vanished the moment the Shah exited the country on January 16, 1979, never to step foot on Iranian soil again. This was not a mere change in leadership but a predatory reclassification of every asset in the nation. By June 7, 1979, a legislative scythe cut through the financial sector, nationalizing all 28 private banks. These institutions, which guarded over 40% of the country's total banking assets across more than 8,000 physical branches, were forcibly merged. A total of 36 separate banking entities were compressed into just 10, while 44,000 private sector professionals woke up to find themselves transformed into state cogs overnight. What happens to the concept of ownership when the rules of the game are rewritten while the players are still on the field? The state did not stop at the vaults. It hungry for the very engines of production. Heavy industry, car assembly lines, copper and steelworks, aluminum plants, and even the insurance and mining sectors were swallowed by the government. A specific mandate targeted the personal fortunes of 58 designated individuals and their lineages. The Pahlavi Foundation, once the crown jewel of the ruling family's wealth with an estimated $12 billion spanning real estate, luxury hotels, and manufacturing, was entirely confiscated. These assets were fed into a colossal new state entity that eventually dominated 140 factories, 64 mines, and 500 agricultural sites. This bureaucratic behemoth, employing 200,000 souls, became the second most powerful economic force in the land, trailing only the National Oil Company. By 1982, the government had successfully claustrated over 80% of the Iranian economy. This systematic harvest was executed through revolutionary courts that bypassed standard legal rigor, seizing thousands of properties under the vague banner of illegitimate wealth. When the legal pendulum occasionally swung back toward restitution, the state offered a poison pill, compensation pegged to 1979 prices, effectively erasing years of inflationary value. The Tehran Stock Exchange, which had blossomed from 6 firms in 1967 to a market-moving 34 billion rials by 1978, faced a terminal frost. Total market capitalization plummeted from 4 billion rials to a pathetic 9 million rials by 1982. This 99% wipeout left stockholders holding nothing but ghost paper for a decade. The rial, once stable at 70 to the dollar, began a terminal dive to 235 by 1981, eventually fracturing into a dual exchange system where the black market rate by 1988 was 20 times the government's fictional peg. By 1993, it took 2,400 rials to buy a single dollar. Today, that number exceeds 1.3 million, a staggering 99.99% evaporation of purchasing power. This internal decay was accelerated by the external trauma of the Iran-Iraq War, starting in September 1980. The 8-year meat grinder cost up to $700 billion, slashing per capita income to 55% of its former glory and idling 70% of industrial capacity. By the time the smoke cleared, the calendar of progress had been wound back 15 years. Amidst this, the November 1979 embassy crisis triggered a $12 billion asset freeze by Washington. The settlement negotiated through Algeria and signed in January of 1981 distributed roughly $8 billion. About $3.7 billion went to pay off loans Western banks had made to the previous government. While the state machinery worked to untangle the financial wreckage, the Hague Tribunal became a slow-motion ledger of loss, eventually navigating nearly 5,000 private American claims to distribute awards exceeding $2.5 billion. This followed a complex division of the frozen treasury where $1.4 billion sat in escrow for contested demands, while a mere $3 billion found its way back to Iranian control. History shows that these moments are rarely isolated accidents. They are the predictable gears of a revolutionary engine that grinds wealth into dust. This specific machine always operates with the same 4-stroke cycle. First, the currency is set ablaze. Second, property is annexed by the state. Third, national debts are discarded. And finally, the former owners are cast into the wilderness of exile. We saw this play out in 1917 when the Bolsheviks executed the most massive sovereign default the world had ever witnessed, simply erasing every ruble of government debt from the books. This was a catastrophic blow to the 1.6 million French citizens and various foreign investors who held nearly half of all Russian government bonds. Their patience was rewarded with pennies and decades of silence. A 1996 resolution finally paid out a pathetic 2 cents on the dollar. As the ruble evaporated and private titles were torn up, the former aristocracy found themselves steering taxes through the streets of Paris. The 1949 Chinese collapse mirrored this descent but added a deceptive sting. Before fleeing, the nationalists forced citizens to trade their gold, silver, and foreign reserves for a paper currency named the gold yuan. In Shanghai, $170 million in private treasure was surrendered. Within 12 months, that paper fell from 4 per dollar to 10 million per dollar, annihilating the obedient middle class while 800,000 taels of gold were covertly shipped to Taiwan. Even the Caribbean was not immune. In 1959, Cuba purged private ownership, seizing over $1 billion in American holdings spread across 6,000 different properties. By 1968, The light of private enterprise was extinguished entirely. Refugees were permitted to leave with nothing but a single suitcase of clothes after their homes were inventoried and locked by the state. Yet, the story of Miami proves that while a regime can steal your factory, it cannot seize the firmware of your mind. Within one generation, that exile community transformed a Florida city into a financial titan of Latin America. It is a recurring nightmare where the primary victims are always those who believed the system would hold. Is the modern investor truly insulated from these ancient risks, or have the traps simply been upgraded? In 2022, the world watched as $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves were paralyzed by Western clicks of a mouse, proving that sovereign wealth is merely a line of code that a rival can delete without firing a shot. This realization forced central banks globally to double their gold acquisitions in a single year, seeking the only asset that exists without needing a third party's blessing. In the Iranian context, the line between total ruin and total preservation was drawn by those who acted in 1977 or early 1978. Moving assets across borders before the exit was barred was the only variable that mattered. To understand the gravity of this choice, one must look at the tragedy of the Elganians. Habib Elganian stood as the titan of Iranian industry, the visionary who built Tehran's first high-rise and managed a plastics empire that provided livelihoods for 20,000 workers. One family tree, two geographic branches, and two diametrically opposed fates illustrate the brutal reality of regime risk better than any spreadsheet. Habib Elganian was the architect of modern Iranian industry, a man whose plastics empire sustained 20,000 workers and whose vision gave Tehran its first high-rise. In the autumn of 1978, he was safely in the United States, yet he ignored the frantic pleas of his inner circle to remain in exile. Convinced that his lack of political involvement was an invisible shield, he returned home, only to be seized in March 1979. A revolutionary charade masquerading as a trial lasted less than 20 minutes before he was sentenced to death. By May, he was executed and his entire domestic fortune was erased by state decree. Conversely, his brother Nurullah had planted seeds in New York soil back in the 1950s, acquiring Manhattan real estate that his descendants nurtured into a massive portfolio. By 2015, those holdings were valued at over $2 billion, covering 2 million square feet of the world's most secure skyline. It is the ultimate proof that wealth is not just what you own, but where the law allows you to keep it. For those without the means to purchase New York skyscrapers, the ancestral insurance policy was gold. Between early 1978 and January 1980, the global price of bullion rocketed from roughly $200 per ounce to $850, a surge exceeding 300% fueled significantly by the chaos in Iran itself. This was not a new lesson for the local population. Gold has served as the regional lifeboat for centuries. As the rial hemorrhaged value, families turned to the age-old practice of stitching coins into the secret linings of their coats to spirit their life savings across hostile borders. This is the physiological reflex of a society that views paper currency as a temporary government loan that can be recalled at any moment. However, the most portable vault in history is the human cranium. Iranian exiles have become a global benchmark for intellectual equity, with over 50% possessing at least a bachelor's degree, nearly double the American average of 28%. More strikingly, over 25% hold graduate degrees, the highest concentration among 67 different ethnic demographics surveyed. Consider the Nazarians, who fled to California with nothing but 4 children and 4 suitcases. Yuns Nazarian pivoted from his tool and die expertise into the high-stakes world of defense contracting, eventually securing a foundational stake in the wireless titan Qualcomm. That family's net worth now reaches into the billions because expertise is the only asset class that cannot be nationalized. Yet, there is a darker alternative to flight, the gamble of the insider. While many were stripped bare, the traditional merchant class known as the Bazaris found safe harbor because they were the financial engine of the uprising. Their reward for choosing the winning side was a windfall of import licenses, government appointments, and tax immunities that lasted for decades. This path to preservation requires no offshore account, but it does require perfect, high-stakes prediction of political wins. A single miscalculation results in the gallows rather than a tax break. For the 2 to 3 million people who chose to leave, the destination was often the American West. Over 40% of these migrants moved to California, concentrating 500,000 to 700,000 people in the Los Angeles region. In pockets like Beverly Hills and the West Side, the community became so dominant that Iranians made up roughly 20% of the local population. The community elected the city's first Iranian-born mayor in 2007. Iranian Americans went on to found or lead major technology companies. Today, A group of at least 6 billionaires born in Iran reside in the United States, commanding a combined net worth of approximately $24 billion. This astronomical figure serves as a testament to a survival strategy rooted in the cultivation of portable intellectual equity and professional expertise that no state authority could ever annex. While the geography they left behind fractured, their wealth was reconstructed on foreign soil. The families who achieved the most seamless transitions were those who established geographic firewalls well in advance. During the peak of the oil boom, when the rial possessed significant global purchasing power, these forward-thinking individuals prepositioned capital in Beverly Hills real estate or secured educational footholds for their children at premier European and American universities. For those who lack such liquid reserves, professional credentials functioned as a vital survival raft. Although the journey to rebuild through specialized networks was a slower climb, it ultimately brought them to the same summit of financial security. When one examines the complete chronological record of the empire of silver and gold, spanning 4 seismic collapses across 25 centuries, a definitive pattern of wealth preservation emerges. What truth does this long data set reveal? In the first epoch, the Achaemenid treasury surrendered 200,000 talents of gold and silver to Alexander's forces. The survivors were those who clutched physical bullion, maintained land titles, or managed the critical social infrastructure the conquerors were forced to utilize. By the second epoch, the Safavid dynasty walked into a financial snare, attempting to peg their imperial ambitions to a silver supply they did not own. Amidst that ruin, the Scaraman family thrived because they had moved their operations to Venice a century prior, opting for the portability of gemstones over the volatility of local coinage. The third epoch's oil nationalization crisis taught a brutal lesson. Possessing a natural resource is meaningless if you do not command the machinery of its monetization. During that period, the gold hoarders and the pragmatic Bazari merchants were the ones who emerged intact. Finally, the 1979 revolution acted as a total vacuum, devouring every domestic asset category simultaneously. In each of these 4 historical storms, the survivors shared identical traits. They held physical gold, maintained assets in sanctuaries beyond the reach of the collapsing regime, possessed borderless skills, and possessed the iron will to move before the smoke became visible. Beyond the political theater of falling dynasties and rising republics lies a deeper financial ledger. The divergence between those who kept their life's work and those who were wiped out was never a matter of chance or political devotion. It was a matter of perspective. Success belonged to the investors who viewed their domestic system not as an eternal fortress, but as a temporary weather system, and who chose to diversify their risks while the exits were still wide open. If this investigation into the mechanics of systemic risk has provided you with value, ensure you subscribe to witness the next chapter of this historical autopsy.